Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes, I guess, talking about this issue of medical causation. And this is the first issue, as you can see from the jury, from the verdict form, that you'll get to in your deliberations. Before considering anything about smoking or the tobacco companies, you'll have to decide if there's enough medical evidence to prove, more likely than not, Mrs. Adamson had a primary lung cancer. And now we've talked a lot about what primary lung cancer means, and I'm sure you're well aware of it by now, but that means it started in the lungs. Plaintiff wants you to think that this is some simple issue that you can just check off without even thinking about it. In fact, I think she spent no more than 5 minutes discussing it during her closing. But you have seen from the evidence and the amount of time we've spent talking about this that diagnosing a primary site is not a simple issue. It's complex. There's a lot of things to be considered. And all plaintiff brought you was 2 references in medical records by people who weren't even qualified to diagnose that disease. They're secondhand references. And they want you to assume that whoever diagnosed her with primary lung cancer, whoever it was, had enough information to do that, ruled out all the other possible primaries. And they want you to assume, yes, and speculate that the doctors got it right. But there's a complete lack of information about everything in the case that happened before she went to the Rhode Island hospital. And the 3 days of records that we have, 43 pages. And so when you look at the case, it's clear that plaintiff wants you to, in their words, put blinders on. Put blinders on and only look at the evidence that supports them.
Check that characterization of
Sustained, just slightly modified. That's fine.
Mr. Luciano asked Dr. Schumann, well, if you put your blinders on and you only consider this evidence, wouldn't you have to say that it's primary lung cancer? And I'd ask you, don't put your blinders on. Look at all of the evidence and look at the lack of evidence that plaintiff has brought you to prove her claim for $10 million. And when you do that, you can consider that at age 40, you've heard, it's exceedingly rare for somebody to get primary lung cancer. And it's much more common to get breast cancer. And you've heard that Mrs. Adamson was at a specific increased risk for breast cancer because of different risk factors that she had. So I'm going to walk through all of that I just discussed with you and show you and demonstrate how plaintiff has failed to meet their burden of proof. And the first thing I want to talk about, which Mr. Bassett touched on, but when we're talking about these gaps in the information that we have here, the law allows you, and the court has instructed you, that you're allowed to consider why. Why do we have these gaps in information? And Ms. Barnett established with the witnesses that it's not unusual to not have medical records this long after somebody is diagnosed and treated. But what do we know? We know that John Adamson did have those. He kept those for 13 years. And in 2008, he told his attorneys, well, I destroyed all of my wife's medical records 2 years ago. And what was the evidence we presented to you today at the end of our case? John Adamson called Morgan & Morgan about filing a lawsuit in September of 2006, about 2 years before this record. And so when you're looking at the gaps of the information, you can consider whether those records would have been unfavorable and consider the fact that he destroyed them. He didn't destroy everything because we do have those personal calendars that he kept, but he did decide to destroy the medical records. And when a plaintiff brings a case, they have to bring the evidence to prove that case. And because of his actions, you're allowed to assess the gaps in their proof against the plaintiff. And again, Mr. Bassett touched on this, but it was well established that there are a lot of important medical records missing in the case. And we spent a lot of time walking through with the doctors how to establish a primary lung cancer. And you heard how important all of these things were. One of the things you heard about was the importance of pathology. And you heard Dr. Robb, a pathologist, talk to you about how pathology is the gold standard for diagnosing cancer. And it's the gold standard for diagnosing a primary set of cancer other than an autopsy. And he talked to you about how it's pathologists who diagnose cancer, and it's pathologists who diagnose the primary site. But in all of the calendars, all of the medical records, Dr. Robb told you there's no evidence of a pathologist. We don't know who even would have diagnosed her. The only information we have is that perhaps it was a diagnostic radiologist who didn't even have the qualifications to diagnose her. But we don't know. We can't assess that because we don't have the information. And Dr. Roser even admitted that he was skeptical about the lack of information available in this case. You heard how he called the plaintiff's counsel multiple times and asked, any more records become available? On the day of his deposition, he said, any more records available? Are you sure? Have you checked? He even said, have you called any of the treating doctors to get information? And he told you. Plaintiff's counsel told him no. Even though we know from Christine Coughlin that she looked up Dr. Spitz, one of the treating physicians, online, saw he was still practicing, and gave that information to the Atlanta lawyers. Dr. Roser said, plaintiff's counsel said no. They hadn't called anyone who would have firsthand information. And we don't have any records from Dr. Spitz. We don't have any records from anyone who treated Mrs. Adamson in Florida. What we have, as you know, 3 days, 43 pages, 2 references, secondhand diagnoses. And so the records we do have do not prove primary lung cancer. And I was a bit surprised when I heard the characterization of the references to lung cancer in the records, that it was clear and plain in their diagnoses that this was primary lung cancer. But what you heard from every single expert that came to talk to you was that Rhode Island Hospital, those doctors did not diagnose Mrs. Adamson. They didn't do any workup that would establish anything other than brain metastases. And you saw that was her admitting diagnosis, that was her discharge diagnosis. They had a chart that had names of people who diagnosed her with primary lung cancer. One of those people on there was her radiation oncologist in Rhode Island, Dr. Choggle. We didn't have any records from Dr. Choggle. It was just a mention that she was copied on the operative report. And you heard Dr. Roser say, when I asked him, well, do we have evidence that the radiation oncologist diagnosed her? And he said no. No, here we don't. And then on that chart they had Dr. Wahlberg, the neurosurgeon, as diagnosing her with primary lung cancer. And I asked Dr. Roser, are neurosurgeons qualified to diagnose primary set of cancer? And he said, no, they definitely would not do that. They would just report on what they see from the biopsy. So we know that neither of those doctors were qualified or made a diagnosis here. And then the other doctor we have is Dr. Krumholtz on the death certificate. But you were given this instruction about the death certificate from the court. And this tells you that death certificates are not conclusive proof of anything other than this is an opinion of a treating physician. But what did Dr. Ozer and Dr. Schumann tell you about what would have happened when Dr. Krumholtz was filling out the death certificate? They told you hospice doctors, they're not going to do their own assessment. They're not going to do any workup. They're there really to make the patient comfortable in their last days. So all they're going to do is usually just copy the admitting diagnosis into hospice. And of course, we don't know where that came from. But it's clear that Dr. Krumholz did not diagnose her with primary lung cancer. So what is conclusive proof of death? Well, autopsies. And you heard a lot about that. You heard Dr. Schumann, who's somebody who conducts autopsies on a very frequent basis. He told you some interesting stories that may seem a little scary about things that he discovered on autopsies. But he told you, Dr. Ozer told you, that those are what is the gold standard for determining a person's cause of death, and they can be very important in determining a primary site. In fact, he said, more likely than not, you could conclude, you could find the primary site based on the autopsy. Because what you do in autopsies are you get to look at all the organs. And so you get to find anything that may have gone undetected during treatment. And what's important to consider about treatment versus what people like Dr. Schumann do is the treaters are concerned with treating the patient, especially a stage 4 patient. And what you heard was that at this stage, the treaters would just have been concerned with making her more comfortable, helping prolong her life. At that point, probably wasn't as important to them to determine the primary site. They didn't go out seeking to prove the primary site. But what Dr. Schumann is an expert in is determining the cause of death and primary site using a forensic analysis like he did in this case. We brought you the expert in doing just this kind of analysis, looking back on available information and determining, is there enough evidence in a legal case to prove their claim? And so he talked to you about whether there was enough medical evidence to prove she had primary lung cancer. And he told you, the expert, there wasn't. And so plaintiff expects you then to use guesswork and speculation to just assume that, in fact, these doctors who wrote down secondhand references or notations were correct. Although you did hear from Dr. Robb about the error rate in diagnosis of cancer and how we have no information here to assess whether the doctors got it right or whether they fell within that 40% error rate that he's personally studied. Done a lot of studies on them, and he's discussed all the places he's published. He's published that work on. And so in order to determine whether the doctors were right or wrong, you need the information. And the information is what we do not have. What do we know? Well, what we know is that Mrs. Adamson was 40 years old when she was diagnosed. And what we know is that primary lung cancer is exceedingly rare in that age of women, 0.01%. It just doesn't happen. And plaintiffs certainly didn't bring you the proof to show that Mrs. Adamson was the exceedingly rare case. That of all the cases that this doesn't happen, that she was the case that it did. And you heard from Dr. Burns and Dr. Cummings that typically for smokers who get lung cancer, it occurs in their 6th or 7th decade of life. And they explained to you exactly why that is, because it takes a long time for a person to develop cancer from smoking. And I think Dr. Burns even mentioned the lag time. And so that's why heavy smokers even don't develop cancer until 20 to 30 years after Mrs. Adamson did. And it's undisputed, as I said, exceedingly rare. Dr. Burns, awfully young to have had primary lung cancer. Dr. Ozer, 40 years old, is especially young to be diagnosed with primary lung cancer. And you heard from Dr. Schumann today. You asked a question, and he said, I cannot even think, sitting here today, of a specific case where I've autopsied someone, a 40-year-old woman with primary lung cancer. And so plaintiff failed to bring you this type of evidence to prove that she fit in this exceedingly rare case. And what do we know when we look beyond just the age at some of the other things we know about Mrs. Adamson's cancer. Well, we had to bring you the fact that this second cancer was discovered. Dr. Robb was the first person to discuss how in the Rhode Island records there was this notation to perineal cancer. And this is a very rare place for lung cancer to metastasize to. In fact, he told you that in thousands of cases that he's done, that he's never seen a primary lung cancer metastasize to the perineal area as the first place of metastasis, like it was here. He says that's very rare. Much more common would be for breast cancers, gynecological cancers, those types of cancers to go to that area. What do we also know about the metastatic pattern? Well, you heard from Dr. Burns, Dr. Ozer, and Dr. Robb that primary lung cancer typically goes to the mediastinal or hilar lymph nodes in the chest. In fact, it usually always goes there when it's primary lung cancer. And it would be very unusual, you heard, for a primary lung cancer to metastasize to the perineal area and not go through that area. And what did you also hear? You heard that a CT scan and a chest x-ray would have picked that up. And so if Mrs. Adamson had cancer in that area, she documented the cancers in the other areas she had, lung, perineal area, and brain. She would have documented that place as well. And there's no evidence that it ever went there. You also heard from Dr. Roser about the typical lung cancer symptoms, and that Mrs. Adamson did not have any. That Mrs. Adamson, who supposedly had an end-stage primary lung cancer in her chest, didn't even have shortness of breath from it. Those things make this less likely to be a lung cancer and more likely to be the more common cancer in people that age for which Mrs. Adamson was at a specific heightened risk for, breast cancer. And when we look at all the cancers in 40-year-old women in 92, we see that primary lung cancer was only 4%. So what does that mean? 96% of the cancers in 40-year-old women in 1992 were something other than lung. 96% of the time. Plaintiff has to prove their case more likely than not. But 96% of the time, cancers in this age woman are not primary lung cancer. And plaintiff has not brought you anything to disprove this 96% chance it was something else. And we showed you this graphic that compared the number of people who get breast cancer, 40-year-old women who get breast cancer, to the number of people, 40-year-old women who get the specific type of lung cancer that they say Mrs. Adamson had. And it is overwhelmingly outweighs, the number of breast cancers overwhelmingly outweigh the number of primary lung cancers in women this age. In fact, Dr. Schumann gave you the example, 10 times more men at any age will develop breast cancer than 40-year-old women will develop primary lung cancer. That's how rare this is. Again, plaintiff hasn't brought you the evidence to prove she was this rare of a case. And when thinking about breast cancer and whether plaintiff has brought you the evidence to prove more likely than not this was lung cancer, I made a refrain with some of the experts. In order to find cancer, you have to look for it. And there's no evidence they ever looked for it. I asked multiple doctors, mammograms, are those the gold standard for diagnosing breast cancer? And Dr. Rosen, you can see here, said correct. He said there's no evidence in this case a mammogram was ever done. In fact, I showed you all yesterday that medical record that said date of last mammogram, and that was blank. And Mrs. Adamson would have been in the age range that was too young for the typical screenings of mammograms. So we have no evidence in this case any mammogram was ever done. And you heard Dr. Burns say 0% chance this is breast cancer. And he was asked, are you sure? Are you sure? And he said 0%. But Dr. Roser and Dr. Schumann admitted chest CT scans, chest x-rays, they're not going to show breast cancer. They're not going to rule out breast cancer. And you heard today Dr. Schumann say large tumors in the breast can go undetected. And you heard from a number of witnesses why that is, especially in women who are overweight, that breast cancers are just difficult to detect. And so in assessing whether or not plaintiffs have proven their case, they haven't proven that the doctors even looked and ruled out breast cancer, especially in light of the fact that their own witness, Dr. Roser, said Mrs. Adamson was at an increased risk for breast cancer based on her risk factors. And that coincided with Dr. Schumann, who said, given her specific risk factors, even taking into account smoking, she was at a greater risk for breast cancer. And the reasons Dr. Roser gave, you saw me right on the chart with him, the cell type, the metastatic spread, what we've been talking about over the last few minutes. But especially the sister, Mrs. Adamson's sister, Ms. Knudsen, testified, and Mrs. Coughlin testified, that Ms. Knudsen had breast cancer in her 40s. At the same time, Mrs. Adamson had cancer. And when we know, when you have a sibling with cancer, breast cancer, that doubles your risk for breast cancer. So on top of the already increased risk that you have at age 40 for breast cancer versus lung cancer, you add that she was at double the risk from her family history. And finally, we talked about the fact that she was overweight. That can increase your risk for breast cancer, but also make it more difficult to find breast cancer. And you heard, again, Dr. Burns say 0% chance. The guy who made $4 million, who's made $4 million doing this type of work, 0% chance, no chance it was breast cancer. But then he was followed up by Dr. Roser, who said, well, actually it's a 40% chance. It's a 40% chance that this was breast cancer here. And I'll note that that's 11% away from more likely than not. Only 11% away from more likely than not this was breast cancer. And when you consider that 11%, consider the fact that Dr. Roser has worked with Morgan & Morgan for 120 cases and made millions of dollars testifying as an expert witness. And so I ask you, may I get the Elmo? When you're looking at the verdict form and you're considering just this first part of the question, before you get to anything about smoking, any evidence you've heard about tobacco companies, take into account the lack of information, the reason for the lack of information, the heightened risk she was at for breast cancer, and put that against what plaintiffs showed you. Plaintiffs asked you to use assumptions, speculation, guesswork, and go blinded into deliberations. And so I'd ask you not to ignore all of the evidence that points to writing no on the verdict form and returning the verdict in favor of Reynolds. I want to thank you. This is my last opportunity to talk to you. So I want to thank you so much for all of your patience and your attention. You've been so attentive and engaged, and I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your service.
Thank you so much, Ms. Turner. Mr. Bassett?